So today we're going to take a look at the Lampizator Golden Gate 2. This is the R2R version, I think, which is about £1,000 extra. So all in all, this DAC runs in around between £13,000 to £14,000. So from that perspective, it's not ultra high end, but it is obviously very expensive. Now what I'm going to cover today is a little bit about why do you need to spend that much, or more than that, do you need to spend that much, and what sort of sound can you get out of a machine like this. And you can see next to it, just on the left, I've got the Soncoz SGD1, which is a £500 DAC, and it's going to be interesting here because there's a lot of talk about measurements online, and does a well measuring DAC give you the same sound that a DAC like the Lampizator will give you for far less money. In some cases I've heard it said that some of these DACs at this lower price point are state of the art and there's absolutely no need to spend any more. Now one of the arguments against the Lampizator from a purist perspective is quite straightforward, and you can see it right in front of you. It's using valves. Now if you are using valves, you're almost certainly going to be adding some level of, I wouldn't say distortion in a bad way, but it's going to make the sound different. And that means that from a linearity perspective, it probably isn't going to give you the exact reproduction of the sound unless the designer has spent an incredible amount of time working to do that, which to my opinion kind of defeats the point of valves anyway. So from this perspective, this DAC is, I would describe it as romantic in a way. It has a slightly warm tinge to it, and by that I mean it isn't bright, it doesn't have the typical digital sound that you can get, which is extremely bright. It does flesh out vocals and instruments, and in that sense my opinion is that it's very real sounding. Now is that the same as you would get out of the box? Well, not in the slightest, and you can see just on top here I've got a couple of valves at the front, one being a Mullard from Holland, and you can see with a metal band around it. That's a rather expensive version, and also you can see a much more modern PS Vane Acme 274B valve at the front, which is much larger but is effectively doing the same thing. Now what you can do with the Lampizator, because of the design here, is very easily change out these valves. So with my other amps, I've got to take the top off, I've got to unplug the valves, screw everything back together, plug it back in, make sure it's working, get it to warm up, and it's a lot of work. The Lampizators are specifically designed so that you can roll your tubes in a very simple way. Now what you have to be very careful of here, and I have done this, is not to blow up your preamp. Now if you've turned the DAC off and you switch the valves immediately, but your preamp is still on, you run a serious risk of shorting out a preamp. Now some preamps will have protection circuitry, they'll stop DC current flowing into them. I run audio research, and my old Ref 3 was not very happy when I switched the valves at the back without turning it off. A spark came out of the valve socket, and let's just say the amp was not very healthy after that. So one of the things you have to be very careful of, even though I do hear that you can switch the rectifier valves without turning the preamp off, I personally wouldn't do that. Just be very careful that when you switch your valves, both your preamp and your DAC are off. Now one of the interesting things about Lampizators when you see them reviewed is it's very much determined on what valves are in it as to what the reviewer is going to find. And we shouldn't beat about the bush here. If you have bad valves, and by bad I mean not necessarily cheap, but bad sounding, veiled, very poor bass, if you have valves like that in these kind of units, you are holding it back. It's like putting diesel in a petrol car at its worst. You can make these units sound incredibly bad. Now just to prove this, I picked up a £15 valve from China. Nothing, no disrespect to the manufacturers, it was made to a budget. And I put it in the front of this and it crippled the sound quality. So you have to be very aware that whoever is reviewing these DACs, ideally they have access to quite a number of valves in order to give you at least a version of what this thing can do. Now the two valves in front, as you can see the small mallard there and the PS vane, are two of the better valves for this unit. The mallard will push the treble slightly forward, so the imaging will sound a little bit more towards you and add a tiny bit of punch. The PS vane throws a wider soundstage and what you would call micro detail, which for me is, if you think about a cymbal ringing out, so you hit a cymbal and then the sound rings all the way until the end, until it stops ringing. You'll hear all of that with a PS vane. With a mallard you probably won't hear the last, and these percentages are made up, but 10 to 20% of that sound ringing out. So there are differences in things like micro detail. And at the back, which is quite unusual here, you can see some very old valves. Now these particular two were shipped in from America, and one is from 1929 and the other one is from 1931. So we are talking some seriously old kit here. And interestingly enough, there is a very, very active forum on the What's Best forum where people talk about all the different types of valves you can put into these units and what they sound like. And to that extent that's very useful, because you'll get, again, people will give opinions on whether or not valves are dark, as they would call it, or bright or wide or whatever, and in some cases which ones you should just simply avoid. Now, why might I want to put a valve in here that someone might describe as dark? And in that sense I mean it has less treble, it's probably got a heavier bass in that sense, because without the treble or the mid-range being accentuated, you often feel like, you know, there's more bass. Generally speaking there isn't, it's just that you've almost EQ'd your DAC. Well, you might want to do that if your system is ultra bright. If it's very sharp sounding, or the treble is accentuated by whatever kit you've got. Sometimes you've got tweeters that will ring at those really top frequencies and create quite a harsh sound, or you've got some electronics in there, some digital electronics in there that are sounding very, very linear, and you want to add what some people would call warmth to the sound, and that's very useful. So another question to ask people if they are recommending valves for a system is, what does your system sound like at the moment, and what are you aiming for? Are you trying to get this DAC to change the sound quality, or what, you know, the sound type of sound that you're receiving, or are you trying to get it as linear and as open and as truthful as possible? Now in my situation my system's quite warm, so what I'm trying to do here is run the most neutral valves possible. I'm really not looking for what I would call that dark sounding tube. Again, I'll just say that to be clear, in some cases that's like chopping the treble off. I really don't want it doing that. I want it to be as simple as possible in terms of not affecting the sound, but also giving me the widest sound stage possible, giving me placement of instruments and that decay I mentioned earlier.